to the cloud. All right, before we start, and remember the Torah portion is Haazinu, or give ear. And give ear doesn't just mean listen, it means consider. If you'll remember, I think in the Psalm, it says, give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation. And so when we're asking someone to Haazinu, we're not asking them to just, hey, listen to this. We're saying, consider the words that you're about to hear. And that's what Moses is asking the people. Consider the words of this song. They're going to be very important because they're going to be sung, again, in the book of Revelation. And continuing in here, what continues is all these dire consequences and prophecies, they continue into the Song of Moses. And you think, what a downer. Well, if you think of who they're for, isn't it really for the person that's standing there that he said, there's some of you already standing here and you're already devising, the Hebrew word was yetzer. You're already leaning, you're already formulating in your heart ways to deviate from this path that I'm setting out before you. And so to that person, I think he's speaking, because if you're standing there with a pure heart and pure intentions, and you're not already thinking of ways around it, then it's one of those things that the curses, they just don't apply to you. They're a good heads up, they're good information, but you don't need the threat. See, if your heart's already there, nobody needs to threaten you because you're going to do the right thing anyway. It's for the people who are already beginning that purpose. Sometimes you have to scare them into obedience. Why? Because remember, it wasn't just Omed, singular, it was Nitzavim, plural. Because if you're sitting here with, like you said, blessing yourself in your heart, saying these things won't happen, I can do whatever I want to, then your behavior is going to affect the entire nation. So whether you have to scare them with curses, or whether you can just remind them of the blessings for having that sincere heart, they're both here for both kinds of people. And remember, at the end of the millennium, the adversary is going to be loosed because there's still going to be people out there who had to be threatened, who it says, yes, they'll come up at Sukkot. Why? Because if they don't, they get no rain. So that's a threat. It's saying there's still going to be some who are holding something back, like Cain. They're not completely convinced that their own hearts aren't the king. So I wanted to read you this little story here. And it has something to do with these, starting in and talking about these curses. And it says, there was a certain Jew who was stranded for many years on a deserted island. When he was finally rescued, he boasted of his many accomplishments on the island, including the construction of 2 synagogues. He's the only guy there, but he builds 2 synagogues. Very impressive, responded his rescuers. But why 2 synagogues? This is the synagogue that I attend, explained the man, pointing at one structure. The other one is the synagogue I refuse to step foot in. The joke would not be so humorous if it did not contain a kernel of truth. The Jewish people often seem to be blessed with an overabundance of infighting. Why is there so much division and conflict? And that was Rabbi Kook writing. And so the same problems that we have as a people turning to the Torah, where we have a lot of infighting and you're not doing it right. This is the way we do the Seder. You're not doing it right. This is the way we do Sukkot. You're not doing it right. This is the calendar. You're not doing it right. This is the way you pronounce the name. Well, they have their own fights too. Now, there's certain things they don't need to fight about. They settled a lot of the stuff we're arguing about. They settled long ago. That doesn't mean that they don't have differences and very strong differences. And you can see that if you just keep up with Israeli news. All the different types of people, secular, religious, and then even infighting among the religious. It's common. So what's going on here? We'll come back to that. I want to look at these curses, and we talked about them a little bit last night, and it's kind of a review because we've already talked about them in the Torah portions before. But Moses is, again, warning them that curses will come upon them if they deviate from this word, from this devar. And there's two kinds. There's the arar curse, and I'm looking at page 217 on the newer version of the workbook if you're trying to follow along. I'm not sure what page it's on in the old one. But on page 217, you can see the Hebrew of the curse arar, and it's spelled aleph, resh, resh. There's a doubled resh, arar, which makes it really hard to pronounce in Hebrew when you consider how far down in their throats they say the R. So aleph is the first letter of Elohim. And remember, Elohim is a name not just of the creator, but of the judge aspect of the Holy One. There's other names like El Shaddai. Well, that's going to be more of a nurturing name. But if we say Elohim, not just creator, but also judge. There was also judgment present at the creation. Things had to be planned, like we were talking about last night, but it had to be a setting of boundaries. And what are judges for? Setting boundaries. And as we see the world moving farther and farther away from boundaries, farther away from any type of enforcement of law or statute, then we see the world in entropy, trying to go back into that pre-day one state, where everything is chaos. It's moving back toward chaos when we try to move the boundaries or simply disregard that they're there. So with Elohim, we've got an element of judgment, and then resh resh, which rosh is the head. And head means your source or your authority. So where is the source of our authority? Well, there's only one. There's only one Elohim, and we know that Yeshua came in his name. So it's still only one authority. When you add another authority, when you add another head, right, that's what kind of worries me when people talk about the Godhead, which is not a Bible word. It's a made-up word. It's a doctrinal word. And I don't know that it helps people understand something that's almost unfathomable when we're talking about the relationship between the Father and Yeshua and the Holy Spirit. I think it's okay sometimes for there to be mysteries. And I worry about people who think they understand it. But there's only one head, there's only one source, and it comes from above. It comes from heaven. In a human being, that source comes from above. And so when you add another head, all of a sudden you're going to go bipolar in spiritual realms. You're going to, because we've eaten from the tree that's been handed down to us, it's in almost every culture, you'll see some symbolic representation like good angel, bad angel, right? In Judaism, they call it evil inclination and then good inclination. They understand that there's two. There's an Esau and there's a Jacob inside of every one of us. There's a Cain and an Abel inside of every one of us. And so if we want to walk in a curse, then probably we're just going to split our time between two heads. That second head we took on when we believed and acted upon the doctrine of a serpent, who was the most cunning beast of the field. So now, not only do we have the authority or the source of our doctrines coming from heaven, but we also have a source of doctrine coming from a creature that crawls on its belly, a fallen creature. So there's a struggle in there. When you allow them both to share authority, what's going to happen? You're cursed. That's all that can happen. You've just created chaos because there's an element of judgment that goes with it. the Elohim part of it. The other curse is a kalal, or klala. And it's a curse of lightness. It removes value from you. So if you're under this sort of curse, it means that basically you get no respect, right? It's people just, I've been receiving videos and some pictures from Rabbi Krieger, who has congregations in Nigeria, and there's an internal problem there right now with a minority people in Nigeria. And she's sending me these pictures of basically torture of this minority because they want voting rights, as it turns out, and killing and dumping them into mass graves. And those are very hard to look at. So that's the thing. When you esteem the lives of other people lightly, what is the curse that's going to come upon you? Eventually, you are going to be esteemed lightly to the point you're going to be so light, he blots your name out of the book because there's nothing heavy enough to keep you in there. It's only through keeping the words of Torah that you have enough weight to remain in the book. When you become the king, when you become the military dictator, when you become the one who executes upon people and you devalue their lives, then you yourself are falling under that klal curse. You will be held in light esteem because you lightly esteemed. You've taken away their value as human beings. Now there's, in both cases, an issue of false teaching. One has to do more with the authority of the teacher, and the other has more to do with the actual teaching of the teacher. Arar is the source. So we got two sources. We've got Elohim himself, and then we've got the serpent. Remember the curse on the serpent, his head's going to be crushed. Why? Because we don't want any more Arar curses. We don't want two heads. We're going to crush his head, and there's only going to be one head over us. So there's teaching from heaven, and then there was teaching from the earth. The teaching from the earth, from the serpent, mirrored the teaching from heaven, but it twisted. It took it out of context, twisted it a little bit, and because of impatience, and because he had the right kind of bait, there was a fall into the Arar curse, where now I say, the Holy One's my authority, but now I say, well, this beast of the field is also my authority. In the second example here, we have the actual teaching. We have Elohim who's teaching, walking with them in the cool of the evening, but we also have the serpent trying to teach his twisted doctrine. And so at the point, you say, okay, I want this teaching, and then I want this teaching, and I'm going to stick them together. And if you see the kuf in klal, it means a monkey. And all that means is there's a reflective quality. It's monkey see, monkey do, right? So if I learn a teaching, if I see you doing something, and I think that's a good idea, you're actually teaching me to do that thing. And so if that thing that you're doing is from the lower realms, and it's not from the upper realms, then you are teaching me evil. I'm taking on your doctrine. But see, I could also take on the doctrine from heaven, from my other source, from my other head. So you become my teacher, and now he's my teacher. But see, I try to put those two teachings together, and half the time I'll imitate, learn from the teaching of heaven, and half the time I'll learn from the teaching of the lower realms. And the biblical metaphors that are used that we're going to work with, it says in Deuteronomy 32, it says, their rock is not like our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges. For their vine is the vine of Sodom, and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall. Their clusters are bitter. So the gall is something to remember. And it says their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of cobras. So you have a kind of a long equivalent expression. You're used to seeing those now. So as the grapes of gall and the clusters of bitterness have a relationship to the wine being the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of cobras. There's a relevance, there's a relationship among those. And the word gall, ironically in Hebrew, is rosh. See where the curse comes in? Because one of those sources is going to be a source of gall. One of those heads is not coming to you straight from the Father. One of those, it says, is bitter and poisonous. It's venom. It's poison. It also means poisonous weeds, the sorts of things you wouldn't want in a garden, by the way. You wouldn't want to chew on those. And what happens when you've got that extra rosh, when you've got that extra head, then you do fall into that category. Now you're drinking from the grapes of gall and the bitter clusters. Remember eating the bitter herbs at Passover? That should be a reminder to us that we don't want a second head. There's even, if you'll notice in maror, for the bitter herbs, how many reshas are there? 2, just like arar. They sound very close, don't they? Well, that's what we have to be careful of, is that if we are taking on a lower authority, and a lot of that is tied up with Yeshua saying, you know, call no man father, call no man rabbi. There's a context for that. Of course, you're going to call your father your father. Of course, you're going to call a rabbi with an earned degree a rabbi. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the curses that come from taking on a second authority in lower realms and letting them have authority over the authority of heaven. There is no father on earth that has more authority than the Father in heaven. There is no rabbi on earth that has more authority than Yeshua. That's why they called him Rabboni, my rabbi, right? That's my rabbi. So we've got Rosh used as describing this curse in Deuteronomy 32:32. In other places in Scripture, I list them on page 218, you can find other examples of this poisonous plant in context in the prophets. And it's frequently connected with wormwood, which we talked about previously. And it refers, this rosh, it refers to a poppy plant also. And a poppy plant is usually a redhead. Right? It has bright red stuff. And if we ever get into Scarlet Harlot, we have a lot of things to say about the red and Esau and the Scarlet Harlot and so forth, because it's a contronym. It has two sides. It has a good side and it has a bad side. And that's why we want to make sure with the Rosh that we're not taking the earthly Rosh manifested in a poppy plant with the red head that represents, red can represent sin. All right, the sinful head. But this juice of the poppies, it's an opium, and it makes a poison. And we can see in our day that what is the big problem of today? Drugs. We've got enemies out here, but we're dying from the inside because not just our children, but our grown-ups are on drugs. And sometimes it can be drugs of self-deception, but literal drugs. We have people purposely engaging in addictive behavior, and then we have people who might have pain or something, and then they get addicted to a prescription painkiller. Somebody's not paying attention. And it's very easy to become addicted. And so what's going on in physical realms is reflecting what's going on in spiritual realms, because what do these drugs do? Typically one of two things. They're either going to heighten your senses, so everything looks better, tastes better, feels better, right? It heightens every sense you have. And so that's the lure. Colors, like hallucinogens, the colors become just awesome. I've had inmates tell me that the first time they did crack cocaine, they could never capture that moment again because it was everything became better. And that's why it's so addictive. It took one time, and then they've spent the rest of their lives trying to recapture that first experience. But what is that doing? It's saying that whatever my source in heaven has provided for me, in the realm of my soul and my senses, what should taste good to me, what should stimulate my intellect. I mean, people will take hallucinogens just for the mind trip that they can go on. Could it make you 10 times better at math? Probably could. For the time that you're high, if that's the direction the drug went in your brain, it can go in weird directions. It's not predictable. And so what are they doing? They want that stimulation. They're saying, whatever stimulation the Father has provided me, it's not enough. It can go the other direction, and it can numb you. A drug can take away pain. So it does the opposite. Instead of stimulating your senses, it dulls your senses. And a lot of time we medicate emotional pain with physical drugs. That happens a lot. Why? I'm hurting, I'm bitter. Sometimes when we're hurting inside, it's because of bitterness we don't want to deal with. All right? And it might be justified. I'm not saying it isn't. Things can happen to us in our lives that make us bitter, that make us fearful, that just kind of strip the want to out of us. But taking a numbing drug isn't helping that. It's just numbing it. And a lot of times it's in those places precisely because you're broken. Remember, we talked about last week, you can't stand and serve in a state of grief and mourning, but he is closer to you than ever before when you're in that state of mourning. So whether you're broken and he's close, or you're standing whole and you're serving, it doesn't matter. Either way, he's with you. And some people feel that brokenness and they just want to be numbed from it. When he says, you know what, let me come in here and help you. I'm very close to you right now. If you just, what does he say? He is close to the brokenhearted. He is close to those who call on him. But you have to call on him. You can't call on Oxycontin, right? You can't call on Xanax. You can't call on Ativan. If you start calling those names, then they'll numb you. They'll give you temporary relief, but the long-term relief is going to come from the spiritual realms. It's going to come from a heavenly authority, not from an earthly drug. Now, if you need it for immediate pain, if you need a painkiller, you've had surgery, take it, my goodness, but just be careful that it doesn't become a point of addiction. I know when I had my first shoulder surgery, I had painkillers. And after about a week of that, when I went back for my checkup, I told my doctor, I said, no matter how much I beg you, and trust me, that thing hurt. No matter how much I beg you, do not prescribe me any more of those. And I would go to physical therapy and cry like a baby. But I would rather do that than get hooked on something that, truth be told, it really wasn't helping my pain. It wasn't. That's what I realized. The pain that I was having was not that much worse without it. It was just simply doing something to my mind. The numbing wasn't helping the shoulder. It was just helping my mind a little bit. But I could feel the power. I think it was hydrocodone or something like that. And now whenever they ask, is there anything you're allergic to? I say anything with hydrocodone or oxycodone in it. Don't give me that, because I sense the power that's in it. But that's it. We sometimes seek the power of God apart from submission to God. Remember Simon the sorcerer? He says, sell me some of this power. And I think it was Peter pretty much said, may your money perish with you, because you thought the gift of God could be bought with money. And drugs sometimes, whether we're talking about the literal physical drugs or we're talking about the numbing that we do ourselves or the power trip of ourselves that we go on, we're trying to replace the power of heaven with an earthly power. Things that make the soul realm go, not the things that will make the Holy Spirit realm in us supercharged. And we know that Satan's head is pride. We're talking about Rosh, the head. And what is symbolizing pride? A proud look at your head. It's the way you look at things. And when human beings practice pride, the illusion of power will grow. It's just an illusion, though. And we can get this illusion of power from the soul realm, from the nephesh, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. When we're stimulated in those realms, we can begin to believe that teaching. See, it's a doctrine that the snake brought in that had to do with the food that you put in your mouth. And not just the food that you put in your mouth. You put this food in your mouth, and it's going to make you wise. It's going to make you smart. It's going to make you like God. What did he do? He wants you to accept this teaching, Lamed. Remember in Kalal, Lamed, Lamed, teaching, teaching. Accept this teaching I'm giving you, and by doing so, you're accepting another authority in your life. But this authority is from the earth. So heaven and earth witness against us. And here's what I pulled out of some research on drugs. We're talking about, we're not just taking on an extra authority, we're taking on an extra teaching. You say, well, how do drugs teach us? Believe it or not, they do. Scientifically, it's been found that drugs do teach us. And I think that's a tool of Satan in this hour, is to bait people with drugs. We think we can fix anything with drugs, right? Here's what it says. And this is going to apply to us. That's why I read this little thing out of Rabbi Kook's about the two synagogues. Even though he's the only guy on the island, he had to build the other synagogue to be the one he wouldn't step foot in. And a lot of times it's about the illusion of rightness, the illusion of correctness, the illusion of knowledge. Was Eve really wise after she ate the fruit? Not as much as she thought. It says, searching the internet may cause systematic failure to recognize the extent to which we rely on outsourced knowledge. People mistake access to information for their own personal understanding of the information. Internet users demonstrated their inflated ego. Now, we don't want to hear that. We want to do our research, and we want to do it fast, right? And we're not talking about, if you pull up Blue Letter Bible and pull up John, chapter 2, and you read John chapter 2, that's reading the Bible. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's not just simply reading a biblical source. And you guys know what I'm talking about. But when you start using the internet for research, that's what this was about. It starts to inflate your ego. What's your ego? Your soul. Appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. So you're going to get an intellectual stimulation that's going to go beyond a stimulant. it's actually going to grow you another head. It says, though some people's online searches were unsuccessful, merely typing into Google and scrolling through the results seemed to offer a confidence boost. You didn't learn one thing, and all of a sudden your confidence, I've researched it. You didn't read anything. They were controlling what you saw, and you still thought you saw something enough to boost your confidence that you knew something about it. It says, even when a filter was put on Google to ensure that the search turned up no results at all, just the message did not match any documents, and a gentle suggestion to check their spelling, the internet users remained more confident about the general knowledge assessment than those who hadn't tried searching at all. Neither the person who didn't search nor the one who used Google knew anything. They were equally ignorant. But weirdly, it's the act of searching, not just simple access to the internet, that gives people the illusion of their own brilliance. Now, I wish everybody could read that before they start researching. Because your natural human reaction and my natural human reaction is going to be whether I find answers or not, simply because I put forth the effort to look for them on the internet. When I'm done looking, even if I receive no information, I'm going to feel as though I'm more of an expert, just because I looked. That should really get our attention, because how much research is being done on the internet? And we're not talking about just pulling up Blue Letter Bible or eSword or whatever. We're talking about researching particular topics. I mean, the hot topics. We know if we allow ourselves to spend the time to jump onto Facebook a lot, to jump onto these blogs, a lot of these websites and so forth, that there's going to be every opinion in the world on this growing list of topics. And it's because we are in the information age, I think, that has contributed to this. The internet did make it possible. We had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Almost weekly, they're finding archaeologically, they're uncovering things in Israel that are very interesting, very, sometimes it's good finds, it's good information. But when you read a newspaper article or when you read a blog, that doesn't make you an expert, because it's already being filtered through at least one set of eyes who have an agenda. I have an agenda. If you're listening to me, I have an agenda. We all have one. We all have the filters that have been put in place there by our experiences, our education, just preconditions, right? So even as you're listening to me, you've got to filter through what I'm saying. There's going to be some stuff you should probably toss. Now, I don't know what it is, or I wouldn't be saying it, right? But there's no human being alive that's going to give you 100% truth the way that John chapter 2 will. So when in doubt, where do you go? You go back to the Word. You never make a decision in the heat of the day that will wait until the cool of the evening. And you know what? If it takes 365 evenings, it's better to wait and get it from a heavenly source than to act too quickly on an earthly source of information. And we do fall prey to that. Most of us, I'm a career student, so I know research techniques. You can't get a doctorate without learning that. So I know how to find sources. I know how to filter sources. But that training was more in the secular realm. It had to do with academic research. But the same skills I've been able to use in studying scripture. But most people don't have the time or the money to spend most of their lives in school. I would still be in school if I could figure out how to make somebody pay for it, right? I'm a career student. And by the way, do that. If you can, stay in school your whole life in some way. I still take a class. Well, I actually take 2 classes a week. I take a Hebrew class to try to stay current with my Hebrew. And I study Torah with an outside source, actually with an Orthodox rabbi who thinks we are just interesting. I mean, he knows who I am. He knows all about us. And, you know, after we met and talked a few times, he said, well, I don't know really what's going on with you guys, but it must be what Zechariah was talking about. So if you want to learn with me, you can learn. So we disagree on the Messiah thing, but how much I've learned. I have to put my filter on, you know, and some things just don't apply to me. But the relationship is good, and I've learned so much more than I would have ever learned on my own, just reading from other sources. And so when we get into a lot of these discussions about calendars and the sacred name and, you know, how are we supposed to count from Passover to Shavuot? Do we have permission to throw out books of the Bible? There's so many. It's just a growing list, and it's only going to get longer as people become more leavened with their own research. Does that make sense? Because even a secular source here who has no interest in what's going on with what we're doing, simply, you know, this is an academic application. I mean, that's what happens. People have an ache or a pain. I do it sometimes. Before I had a surgery one time, I went online and watched one on YouTube. Don't ever do that. At least don't do it before the surgery. Because I was horrified. Like, that's going to hurt. I was asleep. It didn't hurt. I mean, when I woke up, it did. I could still just have nightmares about what they were doing to the insides of me. Well, you know, I'm there snoozing with a tube out of my mouth. Don't ever look that up on the internet. Just keep yourself willfully ignorant till it's over. And then if you want to watch, go ahead. But yeah, you can learn from that mistake. But Peter 1:20 says, know this first, that no prophecy of the scripture is of any private interpretation. And he's echoing something that had been handed down through generations of Jews who have studied the scripture, and they didn't have the internet, but they had people. And how many of you know enough about history to know that there were all sorts of apostate teachers running around in that first century? Not just the first century. I mean, like, what was it, the Shabbatai Tzvi thing and the false Messiah and all that stuff. There's a whole history there of false doctrines being taught. And so to prevent crazy stuff from being perpetuated, which we can't stop it, because the internet's out there. You can't tell people, don't go to the internet. It's dangerous. Or have somebody sitting there with you that can point out the fallacies. And sometimes you can read things where you know people didn't just read the fallacy, they swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, you can't get the hook out without tearing them up at that point. Pardon the fishing analogy, but I've been thinking about Son of Noon. And we know the noon is a fish. And for this reason, they have rules about if you're going to advance an opinion, if you're going to advance some sort of doctrine, then it has to be agreed on by the majority. The majority of wise people sitting there who listen to it have to say, yes, this is solid. Scripture will support this. And then if they don't, then you have no business going around teaching it. Nobody's going to listen to you. On the internet, that's all we have, is a multitude of people running around teaching doctrines that they've never even asked anybody, does this make sense to you? How does this sound? And that's why I like running things by people. You know, sometimes I run stuff by you guys. What do you think about this? Let me try this teaching out on you before I go, you know, teach it over here. Give me some feedback. I've got, you know, mentors that I can turn to on different things and say, how does this sound to you? I've got my local congregation. And so if I start saying stupid things, I've got red lights out there in the form of counsel who can say, well, you know, maybe I'd back off on this one. You know, or do more research on that one. Put that one up on the shelf for a while. And if we were willing to do that more often, when we're not sure, that what I was telling them last night, there's so many mysteries in life. You know, when you're talking about decisions you make with your family, decisions you make with work, you know what's in Torah, you know exactly what it says, but Torah doesn't help you fix that particular problem. It doesn't tell you which way to turn. It doesn't tell you which action to take next. It's okay. Just keep going back to what you do know. That's what Moses says. These things are revealed to us. These things in the Torah, they are revealed. But the concealed things belong to God. And that's where you're going to have to go. You have to go to him. You have to pray and say, reveal to me specifically, because I love your Torah, but it's not helping me right here make this decision, or know what to do, or know how to treat this person. You know, how to really analyze the situation. Because I realize I've got some filters on. Maybe I've got some old hurts, and that could be coloring how I'm reading it. Please send me a counselor or two. Please send me a mentor. You know, even if it's a talking donkey, if I'm headed in the wrong direction, I'll listen to the donkey if it says something. And start with what you know. Just like Eve. She's getting a teaching from an earthly source. If she'd have just waited, let me go talk to Adam. Well, if Adam doesn't know, well, let's wait until Elohim gets here. We'll ask him to clarify what was not clear to us. And the only reason it wasn't clear was because there was another voice. There was another head and there was another teaching. And when things aren't clear to us, most of the time, it's because there's so many other heads and voices out there trying to teach us differently. And so patience is how we get through those times where I just don't know in the situation what to do. Let's see, there was so much to cover. Going back to the drug, because we're talking about two applications, how today drugs are affecting the way that we think. How many of you think we could be addicted to the internet and internet research? Even a good thing. We could become addicted because a lot of these doctrines and teachings that are out there are very titillating to the intellect. Like Eve, I can make you wise like God. But in the realm of drugs, we see exactly what's happening to our minds when we become too addicted to earthly teachings. It says using cocaine once is enough to rewire the brain and cause addiction. It says cocaine speedily rewires high-level brain circuits that support learning, memory, and decision-making. You learn from drugs. You take a drug and it starts teaching you. It starts doing things in your brain. And it says it actually grows these things they're calling spines in your brain. They studied this in mice. So you're taking cocaine and it starts affecting the way that your brain is wired. And you start growing these things that they're calling spines. And it says the more spines the mice gain, the more they show they learned about the drug. When you take the drug, you're learning the drug. That's what your brain starts doing. It says learning about the drug can mean seeking it out to the exclusion of meeting other needs, which may explain how addiction in humans can override other considerations that are necessary for a balanced life. You take the drug, you learn the drug. Okay? If we move over here and we start applying what happens with these curses, if I'm taking Rosh, if I'm ingesting the gall and the bitterness of Sodom and Gomorrah, if I'm ingesting the gall and the bitterness of the serpent, if I'm taking in other teachings and accepting other authorities in my life, I'm learning those teachings and authorities. They're rewiring my brain as I learn them. You see how internet research can be scary? You might think you're just impartially sitting there reading, but at the same time you're reading it, it can start growing things in your brain, and you're learning what you're reading. If we take it back to what Scripture says, in Deuteronomy 32:39, it says, I, even I am He, and there is no God beside me. There is no other head. There is no other teaching. He says, I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. Nor is there any who can deliver from my hand. For I raise my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I whet my glittering sword and my hand takes hold on judgment. This is an Elohim mentality, guys. This is a judgment mentality. I will render vengeance to my enemies and repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the heads of the leaders of the enemy. What's he going to go for when he judges all things? He's going for the head. Because without that talking head, there would be no second teaching. You cut off the head, you cut off the second teaching. You cut off the arar, you cut off the cloud. You cut off those curses from the earth. In 32:4, it says, He is the rock. His work is perfect. For all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. That word for rock is tsur. And you spell it tzadi, resh. Which, if you take the word picture there, what you have is tsar, for the tzadi. Tsar actually means tribulation, but break it apart into word pictures. Tzadi is a righteous, and resh is head. Righteous head. So he says, I am the rock. I am the righteous head. There might be an earthly head down there, but don't listen to that. I'm going to cut off that head. Listen to the righteous head. Listen to the rock. And with the rock, he's going to give you the ability to deal with tribulation. And that's what he does. He deals with Israel according to their relationship to his word. If they're on the obedient side of his word, they will have tribulations with a small t. But that's how they learn. If they're on the disobedient side of the word, then they have tribulation with a big T. That's judgment and that's punishment. Whereas over on this side, it was discipline and learning. If he loves us, he says he disciplines us. So most of the time when we're talking about taking that second head or that second teaching on, that earthly teaching, what are we doing? It's us. We tend to make it something outside of ourselves, but it's us. It's what we wanted. Eve wanted the intellect. She wanted the fruit. So did Adam. Like I say, hook, line, and sinker. They were both in on it. So what did they do? They made an idol. They made their desire higher in that decision than the head of the Holy One. Right? But what does it say in Psalm 115? It says, wherefore should the heathen say, where now is their God? Our God is in the heavens. We have a higher head. He had done whatsoever he's pleased. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they don't speak. They have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have noses, but they don't smell. They have hands, but they don't handle. Feet, but they don't walk. All right. It says, they that make them are like them. And so is everyone who trusts in them. And that's what happens over time. If you keep elevating your earthly head, your earthly teaching over the heavenly head and the heavenly teaching, you become your own idol. You have formed your own idol. That's why idols typically look like either a man or a beast. The beast thing we'll figure out in workbook 2. But they look like human beings. In Greek mythology, they have the qualities of human beings, not gods. All they have is superpowers. But they're people. And the more that you trust in yourself, the more you become like it. The more earthly you come. See, Yeshua came and did these miracles. He healed the deaf. He healed the lame. He healed the man with the withered hand. He healed, Peter, I guess, healed the lame man. He healed people that didn't know justice, where it talks about smell, refers to your sense of justice. He healed people like that because they represent us. Because we are the people who were deaf, who were blind, who were lame, who had withered hands and weren't effective. Right? We were the people who couldn't smell because we didn't know what justice was. If you don't know what the law is, then how can you know if injustice is committed? He came to heal all those things. And I think the drug culture today is symbolic of the spiritual drug culture, where we're either numbing our senses and becoming cold and apathetic towards spiritual things, or we're relying on the senses. Right? We have to feel the Spirit when we go to church. And if we didn't feel something, then God must not have been there. Not true. Right? We have to preach sermons that make sure people leave feeling good. When sometimes when you go to, say, a Rosh Hashanah service, it is very uplifting, but at the very same time, it's going to be very sobering because you got 10 days to get it together, and Yom Kippur ain't no picnic. Right? There's going to be appointed times for you to not feel so good because it's that self-reflection. So when we're adding another authority, adultery means to add another. That's why I don't adulterate my coffee. All right? Like it black. But when we add another authority, when we add another teaching, when we add another head, we're just taking spiritual drugs. And it's either going to numb us to the real truth, or our senses will deceive us into thinking we're doing spiritual things. I don't know, but have you ever encountered someone when they ask you about Christmas or whatever? But one of the counters was, but I just feel so good at Christmas. I just love being with family. Well, being with family and feeling, the comfort of being family, that's a great thing. But it can also be a deception because everything that feels good is not true. And truth is, you could actually just switch that good family feeling. If you just switch it over to his appointed time, then you get all those good feelings you want, plus it's true. I'd rather have both. But that's pretty much where these deceptions enter, through the ears, through the eyes, through the other senses. And we can get really close to speaking the truth. I think that would be the caution of internet study. People will get really close, and it'll make sense. The first time you read it, it's creepy sometimes how much sense false doctrines make the first time you read them until you really start doing real research. And wow, I didn't get even close to getting done, but you can read on. And like I say, we'll work on this a little bit more when we do the Song of Moses. And I think as we go through the Song of Moses, it'll just kind of reinforce maybe some of the things that we didn't have time to cover. But the idea is basically Nun. Joshua, son of Nun, was the one that would lead them over. And when you put the noon, the final noon, Sofit, onto a word, it makes it permanent. So Moses can take us so far, but who leads us in and makes us a permanent resident? Yeshua. And noon has to do with fish. And the first people Yeshua called were fishermen. And he liked to multiply baskets full of fish. He gave us every hint and clue in the world that he was coming in that same spirit of the son of noon, the son of productiveness. And not only was he going to increase the baskets, remember the baskets represent you? Not only was he going to increase the baskets, he was going to make them permanent. He was going to add the final noon to the end. And I'm going to stop recording here, save